and it's in the breaking we come unbound. And it's in the giving we are found. Yeah, you could barely change.
Welcome to A Medicinal Mind, Wisdom and Well-Being, a podcast dedicated to the telling of authentic stories and the sharing of insightful wisdom, exploring science and spirituality, medicine and Mother Nature. No topic is off limits when it comes to growing our personal understanding and supporting our collective well-being. With your host, Dr. Rob Abbott, a family medicine resident practicing spiritually focused and evolutionarily informed functional medicine, we hope to nourish your being so that you can flourish in whatever the moment has called for you to do.
And I know you tried.
In episode 33 of A Medicinal Mind, Wisdom and Well-Being, I step away from the strictly medical to discover the beauty and truth of storytelling with visionary community leader and the founder of Storyslices, Catherine Day. In this conversation, Catherine shares her unique story-based approach, intended to help others find their purposeful narrative, and constructed from her extensive study at the Adler Graduate School, as well as experiences as an executive in higher education, television, and radio. We start the podcast wading in the waters of Catherine's childhood, with the birth of her own origin story, and the beginnings of her calling as a steward of the story, paving passageways for others through life's most challenging transitions. Catherine then outlines her experience studying psychotherapist and medical doctor Alfred Adler, sharing how his pioneering work surrounding the role of community and our collective search for meaning informed the development of her story-based approach. We then explore the fundamental framework behind Catherine's unique method, delving into the spectrum of tragic character states that hold us back and the transitional changes that must take place in order for us to fully embody our archetypal ideals, our super characters, the truth teller, the visionary, the healer, and the artist. Catherine blends her own narrative and even that of her mother into this conversation as she describes the dynamic fluidity of these positive trajectories. And together we seek to uncover what really is at the root of our suffering and our hindered flourishing. Catherine ends the podcast with a piece of her own creative mastery, a poem that will likely leave you too surrounded by the beauty of our natural world, free from the container reality says you currently inhabit. I really hope you enjoy the show. Well, Catherine, thank you so much for joining me today for a podcast.
Thank you, Rob. I'm excited to join you.
I'm starting to lose count of the number of people that Grace Cormier has connected me with after my first podcast with her. It's so many lovely, lovely people, you being one of them, and so glad we're going to spend a little time today talking about your work and your passions. And so before we really dig into those details, would love for you to share a little bit about your personal story and who you see yourself at this point in time.
Well, you had asked me a question about my spiritual upbringing when you asked to have this conversation, and I grew up in Iowa, and when I was a little girl, I went to my parents went to a congregational church, and I can remember my very clearest early memory about my spiritual beliefs or knowing was standing in this very large church with these heavy oaken beams. It was like a I think the church was designed to be like the ark overturned So at the you know, and what I remember thinking was, I don't get why I'm here inside. I don't know why I'm not around, why these beams aren't moving. I'd like to be outside. I'd like to be with trees. And so for me, that the natural world and being in a relatively rural state, you know, the natural world was very important to me, and that's really the grounding of my spiritual tradition. And I also grew up with a great storyteller. My dad absolutely loved to tell stories about his childhood, which was also really informed by the natural world. And so I learned about storytelling and really became very immersed in it. It was also, reading was my lifeline. It wasn't until many, many years later that I realized I had grown up in a house that included alcoholism, and my father, I think, would now be diagnosed as having PTSD from his World War II service. And so I always talk about having grown up with a lot of non-specific anger, a lot of anger issues. And so for me, a lot of what I did was I would hide in my room and read as long as I possibly could and kind of try to stay away from the anger, and also the early imposition of a lot of responsibilities. I took on cooking for our family when I was quite young. My mother worked nights, and so story and imagination and books were my way of navigating all that.
Wow, I can just imagine at such a young age not really knowing consciously how you were solving that problem of trying to swim around this sea of anger and conflict, and finding a little bit of peace within your room, in these books, in this creative space. And I think planting some seeds for what would later draw you to a calling. You know, I was just blown away by your organization, Storyslices, and the way that you, in your mission statement, really seek to help people, you know, holding a space and a vision for them to discover, either as an organization or an individual, to come to their personal understanding of their story, like allowing them to, you know, either verbalize or write out their narrative, and through that, if they're in a, you know, business or organization, more clearly embody that in that business structure. And I just love some of the language on your website and some of the notes that you sent over. And it's evident now, after hearing that story, that you were probably destined to do this type of work. What do you think about that?
Well, actually, that's what I do really believe, is that my mission and passion has really focused for a long time on how incredibly important it is for us to understand that we are each unique beings, and that we have gifts and we have challenges. Those challenges come, our gifts are extremely important to our story. So understanding, you know, what we bring to our lives, what we are especially good at, and then also to understand that it is through our challenges, some of our tragedies, some of the ways in which we have been, have had challenges imposed on us by our environments. That combination actually guides us on a particular path that really only we can fulfill. And I really believe that we are each here for a unique purpose, and that we have a need, that it's really imperative that we work to figure that out and then fulfill it, because the world kind of is waiting, like a puzzle is kind of waiting for each of us to fit our little piece into that puzzle to create a wholeness in the world. And so that is really where I focus. Storyslices is designed to be to work at the intersection of story and purpose, and to really use that gift of our origin story, our roots, where we actually come from, and to grasp that and then put it to work so that we thrive and that people around us thrive.
Yeah, I love that concept. I mean, I can just even visualize it too, working at that intersection. I think you talk about the space, these transition moments, that sort of space for possibly growth or crumbling, depending on how you face that challenge, that transition. And I can just, like I said, imagine that space where the intersection between someone's story and purpose and creating a unique meaning from that. It's really wonderful. I've had a few people on the podcast who have talked about their sort of life story and ultimately getting to a career or calling that they originally had no plans of pursuing, yet now feel completely and entirely at peace and at home doing so. And was really curious to get perhaps an example or a story from an organization or an individual that you've worked with, how you've helped them sort of navigate that intersection to more fully embody what they saw as their purpose.
Yeah, I think one of the things that really, one of the things I like to address sort of early on when people are thinking about this is that we don't all come in knowing what it is we're here to do. On the other hand, I was listening to the radio the other morning and heard a really compelling story of a woman who, somewhat similar to me, grew up in a household with addiction, but she talked about the fact that her very first day of advocacy in her life was the first day she went to kindergarten and participated in show and tell, and she explained that her parents were heroin users, and that there were good medicines and bad medicines, and you needed to learn about those. Anyway, it was on I'm just writing a blog post about this. And so she looks back at her life, and she had a great teacher apparently who kind of coached her on how much to reveal, so that she actually changed talking about her parents as heroin users and reframed it around good medicines and bad medicines, so that it was kind of age-appropriate advocacy. But she has realized that her work really was to be focused on addiction and issues. On the other hand, many of us don't, in fact, necessarily know what it is we're here to do. But that's why I like to focus on gifts and challenges. As you pointed out, challenges can also come in the form of a transition. And so there were certain incidents in my life that I look back on as I had a series of near-death experiences before, or encounters with death before I was 5 years old. My mother had polio when she was carrying me as a baby. Polio was a potential death sentence for people at that time, but she managed to have me, and I had no effects from the polio, although I have a memory of the experience of feeling very constrained. And then I also went through the windshield of a car.
My goodness.
I nearly drowned. And at age 3, my grandfather died in my room while we were both sleeping in that room. And one of the things that it's helped me understand was that I may have a gift for the transition of death itself. Sort of how do we, and I think of that not just so much literally as figuratively. Mm-hmm. I know a lot of your work has focused on people talking about depression or mental illnesses and things that cause us perhaps to lose our way in very critical ways. And so I look at one of the messages of my early experiences might be that I have an ability to sort of midwife or assist with passages, if you will, people's passages. And so I do look at my work as a guide. I see myself as a guide, not as an expert, so that I see my role as one of helping facilitate people in understanding their own story, being willing to dive deep into that story, or whether it's an institution. I've been doing a lot of work with Augsburg University, which is located here, helping them think about their origin story, how they came in as a Lutheran institution, but they also felt less than some other institutions, and they carried that message of being less than others for a very long time. And we worked with them on their story over several years now to transform their story into a new form of pride in the kind of ways, the gifts that they were given, and that redefining what abundance is for them, and really focusing actually on generosity, that through generosity and appreciation, they can claim their truest power as an institution. And so anyway, that's how I think these transitions, I think, are a really important point in the work, and helping whether it is an institution or a person through that transition into their own power is one of the most important things I can do in the work that I do.
That is so lovely, and I completely agree. It's interesting, from the medical world as a clinician, practitioner, I too try to see myself as a guide with individuals through challenges that possibly are transitions. Some of them are transitions actually into the dying process, and eventually trying to find peace before death for both the individual and the family. But I see myself as a guide, and I learned just as much about the human condition from my patients as they're learning about medicine and how to heal from me. And to me it's a beautiful process of relationship, and I just love how you see that dynamic as within your work. And perhaps this might be a good segue to talk about that equality, that sort of shared value of client and guide, or doctor and patient. That's when you truly are engaged in this shared model of understanding and growth, that you see everything as equal. And it sounds like some of that ideology came from a lot of your training and background with Alfred Adler and some of his principles. You in our notes talk about that concept of being on the level with others, and seeing that, I guess he stressed quite early on that it was very important to never see yourself above the client. And would love to perhaps now have you share a little bit about that early sort of training and background and some of Adler's principles, and how it has informed your approach in helping people discover their stories.
Yes, I didn't actually come to Adler very early in my life experience, but I had the mother of a friend of mine. When we would talk about what we were interested in, or what I was working on, this was over many years, she would constantly come back and say, "You're a natural Adlerian." And I had no idea what she meant.
You were like, what?
Except that I what is that? And so I had the opportunity to, this was in about 2010 or 2009, actually during the, right around the time of the economic recession. I lost a job due to financial issues, and had the opportunity to be engaged with Workforce Development Center, where I was offered the opportunity to get a certificate in something. They had some funding. It was worker retraining and so forth. And as soon as they said, you can go get a degree in something, you can get not a degree, but a certificate in something, I said, you know what? I want to go to Adler Graduate School and see what I can get there, because I was so curious about Adler. And there I learned about him a little, obviously I learned about him. Adler was a contemporary of Freud's and Jung's, Carl Jung, and but he was known mostly as an orator. So one of the reasons his work is less understood or known is because he didn't write it very much, and he was German, and so all of his oral work had to be translated from German. But his principles are the root of what we commonly now know as Maslow's hierarchy.
Yeah.
And I like to talk about how Adler would have been appalled that it became a hierarchy, for the very reason that where you started this question, which is that Adler firmly believed that that one of the most important qualities we have to understand is that we are all on the same level, that we are equals. And that when we come into our work with one another, it's imperative that we understand and embrace that notion of equality. He also talked about what it takes for us to feel safe and comfortable in our work and in our world. And so when you look at the Maslow hierarchy, you see the three core ideas that Adler talked about, which is I need to be safe. I need to feel I am safe with myself, and I am safe with others, and I am safe in this place. That when we feel safety, that we can be more open. That I need to feel I belong, that I can find that I belong with these people. These are you are my people. My contribution is valued, and I feel part of the whole. So belonging, and then significance, that I need to figure out that I matter to others, I count, and I can contribute. And what he described was that safety, belonging, and significance can only be experienced and learned in relationship to others. So in other words, the notion of being in relationship to community was one of the essential elements of becoming a fully realized human being. And so that each of us can, if we take the call that we are equal to each other's, we learn about that equality with those principles. And I like to picture it as a circle that you divide, or a pie you divide into thirds, and that the outer rim of that pie, if you will, is community. And so from moment to moment, I'm experiencing my safety, my belonging, and my significance because of how I'm connecting in community. And that to come to that with the sense of equality, I am equal to the task, I am equal to others, is a principle that can actually make that process a much more satisfying and fulfilling process. So Adler really has informed me a lot, and has been essential in formulating the methodology that I developed, because I became curious about what happens. What are the things that get us off track? What are the dynamics that take us away from our ability to be safe, to belong, and to see ourselves as significant? And to look at that in the context of sort of the tragic ways in which we lose our way. And that's where I came up with the methodology that I use, which includes 4 tragic characters, or 4 ways in which we lose our way, and then the way we can find our way back to a more holistic, more fulfilling way, to our more transformational selves.
Yes, and I totally want to spend some time with those, 4, as you call them, sort of tragic behaviors, beliefs, or character traits that I think all of us go through at some period of time. For me, as a hopeful person, you gave me the answer that the only answer I need is that there is always a way back, and you provide that space and a method for doing so. And part of me sees perhaps the practical things nowadays that can lead us astray. I think some of the things in social media, and just a lot of popular media in general, and our electronic devices, that so much that either consciously or unconsciously can be taking us away and leading us into these kind of 4 tragic states. So I feel like I've been trying to identify some of these practical habits and exposures in our life that are leading to these more abstract concepts, but would love to have you start with describing these 4 tragic states, because they are so relevant, as I see them anyway. And
they really are being played out on the grand stage for us very currently. We're living with our tendency to fall into these tragic characters of the scapegoat, the saboteur, the martyr, and the skeptic are the 4 tragic characters. And what really drives those characters, or our behaviors, is a deep sense of fear that we have. We have some fears that are driving us, that lead us toward these more negative states, these more tragic states, and it takes us recognizing that when we face those fears and replace them with some really important qualities, inner qualities, that we can actually move beyond those tragic characters and become our more transformational selves. The actual earliest roots of this particular methodology actually goes back to some work by the cultural anthropologist Angeles Arrien, who also is one of my mentors or guides in this work. And Angeles Arrien wrote a book called The Fourfold Way. It was published in the early 90s. And there was just this little tiny section in the book that captured a lot of people's imagination, because she talked about the underlying roots of all addictions. She said that there are, addictions that we take on, and but that culturally she had studied them and said that there was an addiction beneath that, and 4 addictions that reside beneath those other addictions that actually drive them, and but she didn't write much about those. And so, and I will share those in a moment. But what was interesting to me is that there really wasn't much written by her about this. And I'd also like to add that she talked about addiction before we were talking about addiction as a disease, if you will, or so I feel compelled to say that I hesitate to use the word addiction and I have I've decided to call that a craving rather than an addiction. So it's more of an emotional addiction rather than a physical disease addiction, is what I think she actually meant. Sort of, how do we emotionally convince ourselves that it's the emotional addiction that she was really talking about. And so those 4 underlying addictions that she talked about are the addiction to focusing on the negative, to focusing on perfection, to focusing on intensity, and to focusing on seeking answers to the unknowable, is the way she put it. And so I took those, I actually met with her briefly before at one point and asked her about this particular piece of work, and said, if I were to spend some time thinking about that, would that be okay? Could I write about, could I go ahead and pursue my research? And she said, yes, as long as you credit those addictions and my work, I'm happy for you to do the work. So that was what kind of launched me into my master's research, where I took those ideas and added, the additive was Adlerian principles, and then the 3rd edition was story or archetypes. Those were the ingredients that helped me create the story plus mastery equals more method that I am speaking about here with you and that you've been looking at.
Yes, I love how you have attempted, because I've done the same thing. I've been trying to find a different word other than addiction to describe these, dependencies, or, craving is also a really good term, but these cravings to be in kind of a certain emotional state that creates safety. I think a lot of it goes back to those hierarchy of needs. We will act and seek out certain emotional states to feel safe, and that can become ingrained. Those patterns can become habitual and very difficult to, 1, either see, or 2, get out of. And it's important, I think, to name them in the ways that you have. And so talking about the scapegoat who's seeking to blame, and the saboteur who just always feels like they're imperfect, and the martyr who is just always suffering because they need to help others first, and the skeptic, which I feel like our culture, more than anything, I feel like, is breeding skeptics. I've always liked to say I'd rather be curious than cynical. The cynical person just points out the negative, while the curious person can recognize the negative but describes the positive. And so I love how you're able to take those behaviors and allow people to see that, but then realize that that's a place for transformation, to explore these, as you call them, four mores, as ways to enter into something that's more positive and more fulfilling, and get out of those states of those tragic states. And so would love for you to maybe describe what exactly are those four mores as we navigate from our state of tragedy.
Right. Well, one of the ones I was just working on a report for a client, and one of the things that I focused on there was that I picked up in some interviews with the clients, the group of people working in this particular office setting, that they were really focused on what was going wrong. They just kept complaining, if you will. It was a combination of focusing on what wasn't working and then complaining about it.
Yeah. And
one of the things I learned, and as I've been working on this method, was to look at what is the energy of complaining. And one of the principles that Adler talks about is, he said, the way we get through to our better self is through the term, he calls it movement. In other words, if we are stuck, if you will, on the idea of I'm just going to complain, what is it going to take for me to move to the next place? How do I move to a new place? And so in the method, what I've been working on is identifying what are the qualities, what's the quality that's needed, and what essentially energy is needed to get to that place of greater, of my greater self, my more transformational self. So when we're complaining, we're actually lacking courage and faith to actually express what it is we're unhappy about, to actually address that. And so it takes courage for us to, in fact, own our point of view and bring that point of view into a space where we're not just complaining among ourselves or to others, but actually are bringing it to our place of complaint. And my example of this recently was my mother's almost 90, and she's living in a senior living space, and there are a lot of activities, and she had been going to a book group. And as it turned out, there was a person in the book group who talks too much, dominates the conversation. And my mother would spend a lot of time complaining to everyone else in the book group about this other person. And her only solution was to actually extract herself, no longer go to the book group. She just couldn't.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And what I look at is, well, it's so tragic. She no longer goes to the thing that she enjoys because she couldn't find a solution to, all she could do was complain. She didn't really have courage or a process to solve that. And, I kept thinking, well, all they need is like a talking stick. They just need to actually say there are rules we're governed by. And, in a lot of ways, it really isn't that hard. But, for her, it's just about impossible. And her only solution is to turn away. So that's why I talk about that courage to use your own ability to, and your own sense of authority to help create what you want to create. And that takes actually being on the level. That's really where we experience being on the level to kind of recreate, be the artists. This is the super character that I talk about. We go from being a saboteur to an artist when we actually use our own creative agency to create what we want. And so helping, what I would love to have done for my mother is help her figure out how to create what she wanted in that book group. And actually, I heard the other day that the person who talks all the time no longer comes.
Of course.
So they both left.
Wow.
But I also, in the case of focusing on the negative, what's happening there too is that they don't have a shared vision. It's a really a miscommunication or a misdirection around a vision. Either one lacks a vision for oneself, or you don't have a shared vision of where you're heading. And I think we talk about this in our current political crisis, if you will, that there is a lot of talk about what is the shared vision for our democracy, for our country, for the challenges that we're facing as a more mature or maybe even an aging entity. There are economic challenges of difference and diversity. And so, the antidote to our scapegoating of others is to actually craft and commit ourselves to really talking about what is that shared vision that we have for our country, which really takes us back to what we think are shared values. And so that's a way that we can find our way back, if you will, to a more peaceful environment, is to figure out how we can seek clarity and truth within ourselves, and then also seek it with others. As you said, I think one of the big dynamics is curiosity. Can we be curious about each other instead of judging each other?
Yes.
And find our way back to a more commonality, if you will, common ground.
Yeah, there's a couple of things there I would certainly love to explore a little bit further. When I was sitting here listening to you describe that experience with your mother and her kind of bolting and running from the group because it was no longer a place that she enjoyed, and she just didn't have enough energy to express that, as you said, sort of discontent, and to seek a maybe slightly creative solution, or at least engage in a process of conflict and conflict resolution. I was listening to a podcast a few weeks ago from Krista Tippett, one of my favorites, on being, and it was two individuals, and I forget their names, but one of the gentlemen, he explained really beautifully that our country, I feel like, is in a state where we're really good at running away from things, and he was specifically talking about running away from disappointment. And I feel like that story you just told is a perfect example of, here comes insert disappointment. This group is no longer going the way I wish. There's someone talking too much for my own liking. And rather than seeking, and being committed to the group and probably trying to seek to explain her discontent, we run from it. And his argument, and something that I expressed sort of recently in a blog post, was asking, well, where is our commitment? What are we committed to? And that requires trust and faith, and, as you just said, at least some curiosity to seek a creative solution. And if you are not feeling safe, if you are don't really believe or have a true understanding of what your value system is, then I completely understand how it can be difficult to want to speak up or be willing to engage in conflict. But as I see it now, and the way I work with patients and looking at an even broader level, is we have to stop seeing my problems as my problems, or your problems as your problems, but my problems as our problems, and your problems as our problems. And that's commitment. That's faith. And I feel like that's what you're doing on a very, on a micro level with these organizations and these groups, is you're not running away from the tragedies. You're not focusing on them. You're obviously, like you use that as a springboard to find a pathway out. But you are working with people, and you're committed to that journey. And whether it ends up taking longer than you expect, or ends up being this immediate success for an individual or organization, you're committed to that process. And it was a bit of a ramble, but there was
I'd actually like to touch on a couple of things there. And one
Please
is,
do.
I love what you said about your problems. At the root of that, basically when you said if it's all saying it's your problem, that's scapegoating. That's when we're behaving like it's your fault. And it allows us to point away from us. And what you described was what is really what I'm trying to create in the method that I'm using, which is, this is a flowing model in which we're always going to be navigating between those poles. We're always tempted to start by saying it's all their problem. But that keeps us in the scapegoat, instead of actually moving up to being the visionary who works on creating a shared vision. And when you talked about disappointment, what I'm interested there is that I think disappointment is built on expectations.
Yes.
And so our expectations, which is us saying, well, I expect you to be perfect, in essence, is also just sabotaging both ourselves and others. And it really fundamentally is grounded in a lack of acceptance or appreciation or any understanding or any sense of shared purpose. And so what I'm doing in the report I'm giving back to this organization, where I picked up lots and lots of opinions about all the ways in which the leader has failed them, to really get them to think about their own responsibility. Self-responsibility is another Adlerian principle, that we are each responsible. And so if that finger's pointing outward, it's all about their problem. We recognize, there's who's great, that finger's pointing right back at you. We have to see ourselves in the solution. We have to see ourselves and our own fears as driving our behaviors that are kind of go against the other, if you will. So I really like what you were saying. So this notion of trust and faith and commitment and curiosity, those are really crucial qualities that all could be added into the methodology that I have put together. There's room to add things like what you're suggesting, because how do you build trust? Well, that's a slow and steady process.
Yeah, I know some people have said before. I've been in many circles where they talk about you need to, you don't have to earn respect. You need to respect everyone. But when it comes to trust, yeah, that's something that has to be earned over time. And I've sort of danced around that a little bit. I've tried to be a little more faithful in how I send out that trust and feeling that I want to believe in the intentions and values of other people. But it's certainly something that is an iterative process. I
wanted to jump back to, I just want to say one other thing too, because you said that you kind of thought that we're living in the world of the skeptic. And the skeptic is someone, it's really rooted in anxiety. And I was thinking about, a lot of your work has looked at the issue of anxiety. And it does go to trust and to belief, if you will. Anxiety really is us not being able to be present to ourselves or present to what's immediately in front of us. And it also is often rooted in having difficulty believing in ourselves and difficulty believing in others. So doubt is what drives us. And that doubt and that unbelief, if you will, produces that anxiety, which also keeps us residing in skepticism. And that skepticism allows us to stand back instead of really engaging in the messiness of what it means to be human and to make mistakes and to try again, Yeah. And so, I think fundamentally our democracy is messy. Our lives are messy.
Yes.
To be human is to be messy. And so really letting ourselves recognize that we at any given moment do feel very exposed, that we do feel imperfect, that we do feel burdened or anxious. These are real states of being, and they are important. They're not wrong. They're just real. And my hope is that I can kind of equip people to recognize what's underneath those feelings and underneath those patterns, so that we can be freer to return to that much bigger space in ourselves that embraces our clarity, our courage, our compassion, and our truth-telling, our realness. Those are the qualities that we really need to stamp out those other feelings. And so at any given moment, we need to catch ourselves in those fears and sort of shine a light toward those qualities of trust and faith and curiosity and commitment. And that's how I see all of the work I do with myself. I work on myself, and then I work with others in hopes of really building that muscle so that we can really live much bigger, have a much bigger impact on humanity by committing to what we're here to do and not being fearful of doing that work.
Yes, and yes. Freeing ourselves from that skepticism, freeing ourselves from that burden of needing to give, freeing ourselves from the anxiety, and just freeing yourself from all of these states of tragedy allows you, as you just said, to kind of more easily navigate the world. And I personally can attest to having fought those challenges and faced those fears. You can get to a place where you wake up in the morning and it's very freeing to kind of be away and relatively free of those past fears and to know what they are when they come back, and say, oh, there you are again. I'm ready to. I know what that is. I know what voice is speaking to me now, and so I've just loved the way in which you've described this is quite poetic. You spent so much time creating this method and then just curating it with your clients. I will certainly have for listeners the sort of table, this sort of artistic table that describes this kind of process, this upward movement from this sort of tragic state to that sort of archetypal super character that you've been alluding to, the visionary and the artist and this truth teller and healer, and just this the value systems around each of those individuals, and certainly we'll give people that so they can see this process if they're more of a visual person. And I love too how you've kind of from the beginning said this is dynamic, this is free flowing. Maybe tomorrow all of a sudden there's going to be something entirely new that enters into this process that probably will be born out from an interaction with the patient. I know much of my knowledge, it gets expanded in the medical world when something completely new comes into my life in the terms of a new story from a patient or a new life experience, and it changes how I approach and understand that condition. And I'm sure that is playing out with your clients every day as you work to help them discover their stories. We I don't know if you had any thoughts there, or I could
well, I was thinking about a couple things had come to mind. One is not was not a client of mine, but more like someone I'm in dialogue with on Facebook. And he's a great activist in our community here. And one day I noticed he had posted he was very, very discouraged. And it was one of the first times that I could sort of look out, at something that was in front of me. And and he was asking some questions. I can't be real specific about it, but he is someone he lives in the north side of Minneapolis. He's African American. Our tragedies in our community have made the national stage with the shooting of Philando Castillo and names that are, another name among a long name of people who've been shot by the police. And this is a man who's decided, he's actually funded by the Bush Foundation to really translate his activism into another form. But where he was getting lost was he was lost in martyrhood. He was running out of energy and feeling very depleted. And I was able to just, at that particular moment, I just saw, I have to remind him that his real work is healing. And I, he is a filmmaker by trade and by gift. And what I want to say about those four big archetypes across the top, the visionary, the artist, the healer, and the truth teller, is that I think our tendency is to be afraid of some of those titles. I know a million people will say, oh, I'm not an artist, I can't draw. Well, what I mean by these titles is much bigger than any one form of action or seeing it in one way. And I don't think that my friend on Facebook would say he would think of himself first as a healer in the way that you, Rob, who are, becoming a doctor, think of yourself as a healer. He realized that he needed to see his role as facilitating healing in the whole community. And that by going beyond trying to push the rock up the hill by himself through his observations about our culture and inviting more people into a compassionate and self-compassionate conversation, that the act of being self-compassionate was going to free him to be a much more dynamic leader toward the healing that needs to happen in our community. And so I want people to see that he's actually a visionary, because he knows he's heading toward a bigger vision. He's actually an artist. That's how he lives his life, but he also sees his life in a creative context. He's definitely a truth teller. And where he was falling apart was he believed he had to do it all himself.
Yeah.
So I just want people to see that each of these characters, the tragic and the transformational, we can be all of them. At one time, we may need to focus our attention on one of them in particular that is either tripping us up or is in fact the calling we most need to reach for to fulfill what we're here to do. And so it's what I mean by it being dynamic, that at any given moment we may need to employ our thought process across the whole range of these characters. And the second thing I want to say just briefly that came through I do have a case study coming out in the Journal of Individual Psychology sometime soon this year. It'll be published in the early part of this year in the journal, is that I worked with an African-American person, a woman, for several years and on her particular growth as a leader. And one of the things she liked about these particular archetypes is that they don't fall into stereotypic buckets.
Yes.
So one of the things that she specifically said was that she discovered that this methodology, actually was the better tool for equity work, not equality, but equity work, which is also what my friend I'm referring to is working on. She said, because these characters are more universal and they're not gendered, and they don't have images associated with them. It's very hard actually to come up with what's the image of the saboteur, or they don't easily take that form. And that she found very freeing from other typical archetypes of the queen or the king or the warrior and so forth, that for her, this method really is a tool for really working on equity issues, because they do cross through cultures and identities.
That right there is so beautiful, and something I didn't really fully realize in looking at these archetypes and those tragic states is that you're right, they're sort of free of gender or this visual of what it should be, and that because of that, we can all find ourselves in each of those states, and we can see others in each of those states. There's a lot of fluidity in those descriptions, and you can embody and as you said, it's become any of those positive archetypes at different stages of your life. And I was just sitting here laughing when you were describing that beautiful story of your friend and on Facebook that he was having the biggest problem sort of seeing himself as that artist, or as a healer, and we can sometimes get stuck on our titles. And I would say the easiest thing for me is, like as you said, as a doctor, yes, it's I see myself as a healer, but I've probably been joking for too long now that I've never really fully seen myself as an artist. I enjoy writing poetry, and I've enjoyed these conversations, and just in writing in general, and curating content for our blog and for A Medicinal Mind. And I've always sort of, when people have brought up like, oh no, I'm not an artist, and certainly not an artist in the sense that I can paint or draw. And it wasn't until on Facebook, of course, I had a beautiful comment from one of my close friends who posted after I put up a photo of myself and my fiance, and he had said, it's how beautiful that two artists find each other. And I was like reading that, and it was the first time it sunk into me, because he himself is a beautiful artist. My fiance, she does these amazing drawings, and to me on the surface, they're obviously artists. And his comment there, I was just like, you're right. I need to fully embrace and embody that, and because that's the only way that I'm gonna further my curiosity. And it takes perhaps some other people, some outsiders, to push that, to push us to see that, to fully embrace those different aspects of ourselves. The truth teller and the visionary, and I think that was probably the one that was giving me the most trouble, and it's been fun to sort of navigate that space. So you've shared so many wonderful stories today, and I know I do want to honor your time, and there's probably so much more that we could talk about. I usually leave some time at the end for folks to share just a little bit of beauty and a story, or just anything that they feel that this space really needs. And you sent over something that I feel, just personally, this space would certainly need, and it's this beautiful poem, and you are free to share whatever you would like at this point. But if you feel compelled, would love if you wanted to share the poem.
I would love to share the poem, and I think it's particularly relevant because to our conversation, simply because I was listening to the blog that's one on your favorite list, on being, and I heard this person, Marie Howe, speak about. She was speaking, and she talked about identity. And since all of my work is about identity, I sat down immediately and wrote this poem. And so I will share my poem that I titled, I Don't Know About Identity, after listening to Marie Howe on the radio. I don't know about identity. I don't know about the soul. What I know is the ground, the way the soles of my feet open when I free them from shoes, touching earth so rough and smooth and moist with ancient waters, reborn each morning in the dew. Far below the thin top crust, deep rivers of lava keep flowing in orange and yellow heat, reverberate the energy of creation into action, so subtle. A bean seed emerges from darkness, sloughing a crinkled crown seed casing, a jaunty cap tipped to one side, its pale green stalk straight and proud. It will feed us in July. Meanwhile, I speak with Chickadee, who scolds the chipmunk, now rustling in the dried grasses beside the garage. Dreaming of what is fat and tender and just planted, it's tempted to steal, to fatten its cheeks. Inside, my skin flows with a knowing deep as the lake. Inside, the rhythm beats true and steady. Inside, I hear truth and, reaching barehanded into the dark soil, pull it up by its roots, lifting it toward the sun, blinking against blinding surface.
Wow. You most certainly are an artist. You most certainly are a visionary. You are probably too often for people a truth teller. And as I see it, you are also holding a space for healing. And this has been one of my just most favorite conversations. The poetry behind your words and so much has left me wordless more than once during this conversation. So just thank you for doing your work and holding that space and sharing some of these thoughts with our listeners today. It's just really, I'm so grateful for our connection and for this conversation.
Well, thank you. It's really an honor to be part of your expanding world. I think you're off on a really exciting adventure, and I appreciate so much being included in it. I look forward to staying connected.
Certainly, and I think as we move forward, we'll have to have you come back and share some more stories, because I certainly love living in that space more than anything. Well, until next time, Catherine, I hope you stay warm in the Great White North, and
you too.
So I'm sure our paths will cross in person someday. So thanks.
I hope so. All righty. Well, thanks. Farewell.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you for your presence and willingness to receive a new narrative, a passionate perspective, and perhaps a deeper sense of connection with our collective purpose. Please share this podcast with any and all that you believe will benefit from its intention to relieve one's doing and engage one's being. Please share your comments about the conversation on our podcast page and leave a review in iTunes so that the voices in this space can spread to all ears ready to receive it. Music credit goes to Dillingham for their song Vessel. Remain open, stay curious, and forever be love.
You walked on fire, and I know you tried.